These are my top tips as a professional astrologer about what to consider when booking an astrology reading. And this video has really come about as a result of clients coming in and not really knowing what questions to ask or how to maximize their time in a session. So we are going to be demystifying that experience today. We will be talking about the experience before, how to prepare, what to expect during, and even afterwards. And this video is for you if you have never had a reading before. It is also for you if you have had readings, but maybe you don't know all the ins and outs that you could be doing in order to, again, maximize the time that you are with the astrologer. So we are going to be focusing today on the birth chart reading as well as the year ahead reading, because those are the two more common types of readings people like to order or like to book. In a future video, I may do something else on the other types of readings, but I think this is going to give us a pretty good foundation for starting off and understanding this idea and concept. And to begin with, I'm going to be talking about the actual foundational piece, which is how I prepare as an astrologer for a reading, because I think this information is going to give you a little bit more to work with in terms of understanding what happens before we even get in front of you, get in front of the Zoom call, or get in front of you in person. This is a piece that we don't talk a lot about because every astrologer's process is different. But nonetheless, I want to give you a little bit of insight into what that might look like so that you have a bit of sense of what happens as we lead up into the reading as well. My name is Deborah Lina. I'm a professional astrologer. I use a blend of Western and Vedic techniques, sometimes Persian techniques, to look at horoscopes. So birth chart readings, year ahead, and relationship synastry. And this is the perspective from which I am going to be speaking about today, as well as, of course, my own personal experiences as having had lots of different kinds of astrology readings over the course of the years. And to begin with, we want to understand that there is a process for preparing for a reading. And everyone's process, again, is going to look different. But first of all, we're going to ask you for your birthday information. So your birthday, your exact birth time, as well as your birthplace. These are the three things that we definitely need in order to move forward. Now, this question around the accurate birth time can sometimes stump people because maybe it's not written on your birth certificate or your parents can't remember. Very, very common. I will be making a whole separate video about what to do if you cannot find your birth time, because otherwise we're going to segue into something completely different today. But just to say that this information is critical. And even though we are using software, so we put your information into the software, and I like to use the software, I also like to draw the chart out by hand first. This allows me to connect to the chart, and it's what I call this marination period. I will draw the chart out, I will make my initial notes, and then I'm going to come back to it over, the course of however many days I have to prepare for the reading. This is why having the time to prepare is nice. I know a lot of astrologers also like to work in this fashion, and it really gives an opportunity for the chart to just sink into our psychic space. This is the time where you have already invited us to enter that space, to start thinking about your life and thinking about your chart in this way. So that first piece is just connecting to the chart, letting it sink in. And again, how we navigate the reading and the preparation is going to depend on what is the reading that you've ordered. Okay. So in my case, sometimes I like to go back to my books. I like to go back and see what are the things maybe necessary in order to go deeper into the chart. If we are talking about year ahead readings, then I may look at different kind of predictive techniques. We might be getting into the nitty-gritty of transits, of solar returns, of dasha systems, different time lords. So all sorts of different techniques may be used in order to prepare for the reading. And today I'm only going to be focusing on astrology readings. So this is purely astrology readings. Some astrologers do use different modalities. They may use tarot cards. They may use different metaphysical modalities. But in this video, we're only focusing on what it might look to investigate a classic an astrology reading. The other thing is that we may not be using every single technique in every single reading. Because remember, we only have 75 minutes to 90 minutes, maybe only an hour in some cases, to dive into the chart. So we want to be able to extract the correct information for that particular sitting. That means that we are not going to be able to cover every single thing in your birth chart in that specific amount of time, but we are going to want to focus on the thing that we feel you need to know the most. Depending on the reading, again, I'm going to break it down when we get to the birth chart reading and the year ahead reading. But depending on the reading, we're going to focus on different things. The thing is that ultimately, though, the more that we prepare, the more that we are able to see and summarize exactly what it is we need to whittle down this conversation to. Because initially the chart will open up and there's going to be a flood of information. And then as we start to construct the bits and pieces of the chart together, we start to see, okay, these are the things that are really going to be important in this period to discuss. And this is also another reason why it's important to understand how to prepare on your side, because what we're doing is we're going to really try and get to the bottom of what it is that you need to know. Even though the readings in some cases are general readings and we're going to cover a wide range of topics, in my experience, there's usually a couple of things that are really key and critical to address with the client, and that's what we don't want to leave without. Most people are going to start with the birth chart reading. So it's the examination of the natal chart, the foundation. It really is from which everything spawns. Even though nowadays there is a habit of going straight to what's happening in the year ahead, without really understanding the basics of your birth chart, sometimes it's more difficult to navigate what's happening in the year ahead. And I don't think we focus enough on that idea because we're in a rush to figure out what's happening externally. And in fact, I even know some astrologers who only will do the subsidiary readings, such as the year ahead readings or other types of readings after they've done the birth chart reading with you, because that way they're all on the same page. And I kind of understand where they're coming from, because you really get a sense of the foundation so that you actually don't need to rely so heavily on all of those other readings. So that's something that maybe you can marinate on as well, because it is quite an important tip. The second thing is that knowing your birth chart does not mean you need to know astrology. I always say that you don't need to know anything about astrology to benefit from it. When you're having a birth chart reading, it does not need to be filled with the jargon. It doesn't have to be filled with the conversation around the planets. What you need to know is the contents. What's happening from a personality perspective? What's going on with your character, your relationships, your vocation, profession, health? So that's what I mean by knowing your birth chart. With that foundational information, that's when you can get to that next step. Now, if you are somebody who is into that kind of jargon, like you want to know about the planets, or you've been studying astrology and you enjoy that kind of process and conversation, that's great. You can also inform the astrologer about that. But for the most part, I have a lot of clients who don't know anything about astrology. We don't talk about the planets. We just talk about what they need to know in their birth chart, the pure contents, so that they have something to work with. In certain cases, if it's helpful to draw some analogies by using the language of astrology, then I will choose to do that. But some people don't want that. And so when you're getting a reading, you don't have to expect to know everything about astrology in order to understand your birth chart. It's just a helpful angle if you so choose. The other analogy that I like to draw from is this idea that the birth chart is the map, or it's the destination. And when we are getting a year ahead forecast, what we're doing is we're checking the weather on that map. But if you don't know the destination, if you don't know if it's a city or if it's a mountain or if it's a beach, the weather pattern is a peripheral piece of information. Like, it's nice to know that it's going to be sunny or raining, but you don't actually know what to do with that information because you don't know what the destination is like. So understanding the foundation, understanding that map is really going to be very helpful for than utilizing all of the other readings like the year ahead forecast or even relationship readings, which in order to really benefit from a relationship reading, the first thing that you need to know about is yourself. Okay. I also find that some people think they know their birth chart because they've had a reading 10 years ago. If you've had a reading 10 years ago, but you have not studied astrology at all since, it's very likely that there's big gaps of information about what your birth chart is about. I know a lot of people like to focus on the sun, moon, rising nowadays because that's something that's we can easily check online. The birth chart actually has a lot more to do with that. And the nuances, the devil is in the details when it comes to astrology readings. And the thing is that this is a confronting experience, but the more that we know about the nuances of our chart, the more that we can identify them before they arrive. Oftentimes when I have readings, people are coming because really this is the last opportunity, this is the last step, it's the last option, they've exhausted all other options. And from an astrologer's perspective, or from any practitioner's perspective, we want to be able to support and help you before that moment has arrived. And the best way to prevent that is really knowing the foundations of your birth chart. Because the more that you know about that, again, the more that you have the sensitivity to see what might be coming for you as well. And I'm saying this because oftentimes when people are coming in for year ahead forecasts or transit readings, if they don't have a really good foundation of their birth chart, what we're often discussing is repeated patterns that are coming from the birth chart. So again, I'm harping on about this because even though I know that there's no hard and fast rules about what the order is of readings that you're getting, I'm saying that I think that you would maximize your value by focusing on the foundation reading first and foremost. And I'm also just reiterating that it's easy to get to the external factors. It's the wrong timing, it's the wrong location, it's the wrong person. And sometimes those things are true. Okay, so I'm not disregarding that. I do a lot of year ahead readings. I love the forecasts, but we don't want to completely disregard the birth chart. And I have also found that I think people think the birth chart reading is just not as sexy as knowing the future predictions. I think there's something more mystical for people in talking about the future, in talking about these cycles. But I guarantee you there's a ton of mysticism and intrigue in the birth chart reading itself as well. We're going to be now talking about the breakdown between the foundation reading, the birth chart reading, as well as the year ahead forecast reading, how to prepare for those two. But I'm going to start by talking through general indications of how to prepare for reading. And to start off with, we want to go all the way back to a few weeks out or a few months out from your reading. You've booked a reading, you know it's coming. You can already start by thinking through some of the things that are important for you to address in that reading. This seems like an obvious one, but I have so many occasions where clients will email after the reading with all of the things that suddenly have come to the forefront. Now, I will be addressing follow-up questions in the end of this video, but just to say that once you start to put your own mental space, you're journaling about what you want to talk about in the reading, and you're letting that kind of sink into your own mind, you're going to be directing your energy so that you know what it is you would like to talk about. Remember that we only have 60 minutes or 90 minutes in a reading. And just like you're not going to change your entire life in one session of therapy, you're not going to do the same thing in astrology readings either. There is this idea that astrology readings is like pulling this rabbit out of a magic hat. And while there's a lot of information that can be unpacked during a reading, we do still want to narrow it down. Of course, as the astrologer, I am going to know what it is that you generally want to speak about, or what are some of the pain points or things that are important to you in your chart. But this is an opportunity for you to get into that same headspace, and I'm going to talk about why that's important as well. The other thing that I will ask clients is if they have had an astrology reading before. This just gives me an idea of where your head is at. Some people have had many astrology readings. They love the jargon. Again, they want to get into the nitty-gritty. Other people have never had a reading, and it really helps me understand how to prepare the reading so I can have that in mind as I'm delving deeper into the preparation period as well. So fast forward to the day of the reading and how to prepare and address that specific moment. First of all, this is a confidential space. I don't know if this is an obvious thing for people to know, but I just want to say it out loud because this is a super important part of the astrological practice, is that confidentiality, is that discretion. I've had some clients who are nervous about that, and I will explicitly say that this is a confidential space. I will never say anything about your reading or even having had a reading with you. If I meet you in real life, in the streets or with other people, I will not say that we know each other unless you acknowledge that. It will always be treated with discretion, especially because I know that a lot of people don't want to admit that they get an astrology reading every year or have that as part of their life. There is still this sort of taboo experience, and I completely respect that. So I know a lot of astrologers who work in that same fashion. But if you have any doubts or concerns, that's something that you can just address when you're booking the reading or if you are about to start a session. Now, on the actual day, I also consider the space that we enter into with the client a sacred space. Getting an astrology reading is kind of a scary thing. I get butterflies sometimes. The client may get butterflies. I've definitely gotten butterflies going into a reading. So I just want to acknowledge that as well, because I don't know that we talk about that piece enough. It is a sacred space. We are transitioning into a different state when we are going into an astrology reading. We are so used to just hopping on a Zoom call and things starting, but the truth is that there is a process of getting into a state when you are having an astrology reading where things start to open up for both sides. So whatever you can do to get into that state is important. The first thing that I recommend is getting into a quiet place. This sounds like an obvious one, but not having distractions, not having other people in the room. If you do have other people in the room, wearing headphones so that you have privacy, because you are essentially creating a cocoon for yourself to have an interaction with someone else. And this is not always possible. I understand that. But the idea is that you are focused and you are not distracted. Often people think that they have a recording so that they can just listen to the recording afterwards. And in certain cases where it's more mechanical, like for example, you're getting the year ahead forecast and you're getting a bunch of dates, that is true. But often the thing that you take away from the reading is not necessarily the words that you listen to in the recording. You may have an idea that you're going into the reading for one thing, but the astrologer may pick out something else that is also going to be a profound experience for you. So allow yourself the opportunity to receive that. If you're in a room where you're distracted and there's a lot of things that are pulling your attention, that opportunity may not be so readily available for you. And again, this video is about maximizing the value that you are getting from the reading. Some people also like to bring a notebook. This is also completely up to you. I know people who process information through writing. After a session, they will have written a whole notebook's worth. If you get a reading with me in person, I provide a notebook for you. So some people really love that experience. Some people just want to sit back and let the information get absorbed. Again, it is completely up to you. One thing that I have noticed though, and this is also coming from my own experience, is you may write a few things in the notebook, but sometimes you look back and you think, what did I mean by that? What was I writing? Or that doesn't make any more sense to me. And that happens because we are entering into a slightly different state that frankly I cannot explain, but different information becomes available. So sometimes it's helpful for writing if that's the person that you are, if you like to process information through that, but also trust that the right information is going to come to you in the reading. Trust that you will also be able to ask the right questions. Do your preparation, but also trust that that will naturally flow. And if I can give my own experience is before a reading, I may have 8 to 10 pages of notes for a client. different charts, solar returns, and all sorts of diagrams and notes and things that I've been thinking through. On the day of the reading, I'm not really referencing the details of those notes. The information that I've written is already coming to me. So I find that people also have that on the receiving end. And that's something to consider with not giving yourself the pressure that you need to write everything down. The other thing is, don't come starving. Come full, but not over full. Come sober. There is a sort of, again, a state that we're getting into, just like you're slipping into a meditation of some type. Try to center yourself if you have a moment to do that. I know it's not always possible. People are booking things back to back on Zoom. But if you are, again, wanting to really take full advantage of that, giving yourself a window to warm up by centering and grounding yourself, whatever that looks like for you, can be helpful in getting straight into the reading. For me, right before a reading, I like to do a short meditation. I'm chanting, I'm doing some mantra, I'm doing whatever it is that I need in order to get into my zone before I get on the call with you. You're not going to be seeing all of that, but I also have things where I need to transition from one state to another. And remember that I have spent hours upon hours looking at your birth chart before we have met already, especially if this is your first time reading or if it's your first time working with that particular astrologer. It takes a little bit of time to warm up with someone. That's normal, and that's a normal part of our human condition. So if you can center yourself before you get onto the call, then you don't need that 10-15 minutes on the call to get warmed up and start to kind of ease into that state. And the other reason I'm saying that is because people will get into a state a little bit later into the reading because they've just come off a busy day or they've just come into the reading a little bit flustered. And then suddenly everything will start to open up for them in the last 20 minutes of the reading. And they'll feel rushed to get all the information out. So this is just an idea that you could start to center and ground yourself beforehand to be able to let that information sort of open up and flow for you a little bit more quickly. And then you can get the most out of your full hour or hour and a half with the astrologer. So with that in mind, those are the preparations for readings in general. But now I'm going to be diving into the differences between preparing for the birth chart reading as well as for the year ahead. And we're going to finalize with what to expect after the reading is over. So if you're getting that classic foundational reading, the birth chart reading, the natal reading, then there are a few ways that we might navigate this. For me, I like to read blindly, meaning that I'm not going to research you on the internet. I just want to see your chart and let the information flow from there. Especially if this is my first time getting to know you, our first encounter, then that blind reading is for me optimal. Of course, different astrologers are going to work things in different ways, so it really depends on the person. But I know a lot of astrologers who like to work in this fashion as well. And you may also receive a questionnaire from certain people, like, is there any context that you want to share before going into this reading? Maybe you'll get some other questions. These things are totally optional to reply to. It's how you want to navigate, and how much information you give is totally up to you. There's zero pressure, because I also understand that it takes some people to get comfortable with a new person, and that's also perfectly normal. I will ask whether or not you've had an astrology reading before, just to have a little bit of context to see, is this person comfortable with that space, with that headspace? Especially when we're getting into a reading, it's going to get intimate. Are you ready for that experience? Do you know maybe what we're going to get into? And also, if you're really into astrology, maybe you want all the jargon. Okay, so we're going to tailor the reading according to your needs and your expectations. There is an exception to this reading blindly rule, and that is if you have a burning question. So if you have a question which has prompted you to come for a reading, then by all means, you are free to ask that. You can email before, or you can talk about it during the reading. This is something that is totally up to you. Do you want to present it right before we start the reading? Is it something that only after you feel comfortable and you've got all the information you want to share? Again, go with your own flow. Generally speaking, as the astrologer, we are going to know whether you are somebody who needs a little bit of time to warm up or if you're somebody that wants to start chit-chatting right off the bat. And in my experience, I just go with the flow of that person. I know that they're going to be someone that takes a little bit of time to warm up, so they may not have any questions or they may not want to divulge any information because oftentimes I find people want to test the astrologer, which is perfectly fine as well. But if there is a burning question, just be mindful of the time. And hopefully the astrologer is addressing, the elephant in the room or something that's really sitting with you. Remember that coming from the astrologer, we want to make sure that your questions are answered because that is the point that we are there. And from a natal chart reading, what we're doing is we're going to be covering all of the different areas of life. So it could be family, health, profession, relationships. It is generally considered the more full coverage reading. Having said that, if your birth chart focuses on one area, for example, relationships is really a key theme, or profession is really a key theme, then the reading may naturally gravitate towards that. Some astrologers will try and cover as much ground as possible during the birth chart reading and get all into the nitty-gritty and get all the information about every area of life. Other astrologers like to really focus on specific elements that really stand out and that are going to be pivotal for your understanding of your chart. So it really depends on the person, but you can expect that the natal chart reading is trying to give you the basis from which everything spawns. And of course, I said there's going to be exceptions because if you've got a chart that's heavily focused or dominated with one or two themes, then the natural course of the reading is going to go there. Every astrology reading is different. Astrology readings from different astrologers may also be different. And of course, this goes into what kind of astrologer are they? Are they a traditional Hellenistic astrologer? Are they an evolutionary astrologer? That goes into another video that I may be making about what kind of astrology readings you might consider or what kind of techniques and types of astrologers are suitable for you. But just to share that the natal chart reading is just this headline, but it really dovetails into different kind of situations depending on your chart and depending on the person. The next kind of reading is the year ahead forecast or the transit reading, the astral planner. It is a time-based approach, meaning that the birth chart is the default setting that you might have in your life, whereas in certain years, certain parts of that life may be more lit up. Certain expressions of your birth chart are going to be more prominent and activated, which is another reason why knowing your birth chart is so important, because you're not going to really understand what's being activated. If you don't know what's really happening by default in career, when you're having a career transit, it's a little bit more difficult to navigate. You don't need to know your birth chart in order to get a year ahead reading. So while I have harped on about this from the perspective of maximizing your value, you can get a year ahead reading every year and never get a birth chart reading. Some people do it the opposite. They get the year ahead reading and then they realize, oh, actually, I would benefit from knowing a little bit more about my birth chart because then I don't have to rely so heavily on what's happening with the weather patterns. Why are we getting a transit reading? The astral weather is constantly reverberating against us. You know that every month we have a new moon, we've got a full moon, we've got planets changing signs, there's all sorts of activity. However, there's certain things that are going to be more important for us to notice than others. And what we're doing with the transit reading is we are seeing which parts of life are going to be more active, what needs the focus, and what do we need to let go of. Because in a world where we feel like we need to be on top of our profession, our relationships, our health, our money, all at the same time, what we're doing when we're tapping into transits is we are understanding that things have divine timing, that it is not always going to be an up year for your career. It is not always going to be an up year for your health. And we want to know what that cycle looks like, so that we can be willing to let things go. For example, if it's not the year that your career is going to blossom and things are going to be a little bit harder, then don't expect to have the promotion. Don't get disappointed when you have less of an opportunity, because your time will come and it may just be in a couple of years' time. This is what we're trying to deduce with the year ahead forecasts. We're not saying you're never going to get that. What we're saying is there's timing for things, and you may just want to be a little bit more patient and, best of all, have an opportunity to plan long term. The other common misconception about the year ahead forecast is that we are controlling the future. We are definitely not controlling the future. We are getting a sense of what's coming for us, and we're better able to position ourselves for that. For example, if this is a year in which you can expect to have some more expenses, then you want to know that you want to be saving in the months prior to that. You don't want to be spending extravagantly because it's going to be more difficult next year. We can always mitigate these situations, but we may not be able to prevent the things from happening. And it's an opportunity for us to change our mindset. I find that a lot of people coming into the year ahead readings, they have a sort of premonition or a sense of what is coming for them. But what we're doing in the transit reading is we are naming it more precisely, and we're also giving it a time frame. So you have a sense that you're ready to step into this new career path, but you're not exactly sure about all of the details, or you're not sure how long this opportunity is going to last, or how long this creative period is going to be. So if you know that that creative period is going to be roughly for X time, you can put all of your effort into that, and you can also manage your expectations around other parts of your life. So the planning of the year ahead calendar is really an opportunity for us to take a step back and just be more mindful about the divine timing for us. And that's also why it comes back to when we know what the destination is, the birth chart, we can also plan a little bit better. For example, if you know that you need to go to the mountains, well, then you know what kind of rain gear you want to bring. You know what kind of sun gear you want to bring. This will give you a better sense of how to prepare when you know what the weather is going to be like. If there is a lesson to be learned, we are going to learn it. And having the reading will not prevent us from learning the lesson. We are not able to manipulate our way out of a situation. What it is it's going to make sure that when the lesson arrives, we know that that's the thing that was really important for us in that year. And what we're doing is we're sensitizing ourselves to the weather patterns. Just like when winter is coming, we start to feel that nip in the air. We start to feel the changing of the seasons. Well, when you start to get really honed in on the different cycles of your life, the different planetary cycles, the different time cycles, you also start to understand, wait a second, I'm starting to see these patterns. We are studying the cycles of the sky and being able to become more and more sensitive to the way that nature naturally flows. This is a really fascinating part of astrology. It is not just about predicting the future so that we can make our life easier. It's about being able to identify the cycles and the patterns that come in and out of our life so that we can deepen our relationship to our birth chart. The planner or transit reading is slightly different from a technical perspective, meaning that with the birth chart reading, I might not want to have any context at all. With the planner reading, it's helpful to know some context. Just to illustrate, in any given day, I might be looking at my own transits, the transits of my loved ones, of people close to me, to get a sense of what's happening in their life. I do this all the time. It takes up hours and hours of my working life. It's part of my practice. It's part of my research. So we can be looking at your chart literally for hours on end, but we only have 60 minutes to 90 minutes in a reading. Which is why if there is a very pertinent piece of information that you need to figure out in this year, it is good to bring that up. You don't have to. You can always leave it again to the end of the reading or to during the session. But because there's so many different nuances in any given year and so many different transits, we want to be able to really focus in on a few things. Naturally, before you come in, I'm going to know that it's a year in which you're struggling with your profession or you need to move house, but we may not know all the details of your private life. So, for example, if it is a year where I'm seeing that you're trying to make a move or that you're thinking about a relocation, and you tell me, actually, yes, I need to sell my house, well, then it might benefit me from knowing the date of purchase of that house or the day that you saw the house in the first place to get a better sense of when you might be able to make a sale or what your relationship is with that place. If you're thinking about getting pregnant, and I can see that there may be some indications of kids or pregnancies, we may want to talk about why this pregnancy is different from the last one. Well, in that case, we might need to have a little bit more information. And oftentimes, you'll need to go back to your WhatsApps or you need to go back to your Gmail and look for all those dates. There's a little bit of work on your part. So in that case, you get to the reading and you find yourself without the pertinent information to get into the details of the conversation. And so giving context to the astrologer is just a way to speed up the process so that by the time the astrologer has met you, we have already looked at those important dates in your life that are related to the questions that you need answered. This is not always important. Sometimes you may not have a really specific thing that you want to address, or we may not have needed any extra information. So it's completely up to you whether you want to provide context. If I have a client that I know is coming back every single year, I will keep a running timeline of the events and things that they've shared with me over the number of years because I like to study how the planets behave and affect them personally, because Jupiter doesn't affect everyone the same. Mars doesn't affect everyone the same. So I get to really understand the nuances of how the planets behave for you. But if this is your first time reading with someone, then they may not have that same benefit. They may not have that same information. So if you provide a little bit of context as to maybe some things that are really bothering you, then you can really deep dive and make sure that those things are answered. Again, I've got clients who come in and they don't want to share anything at all. And I also have clients who give me a full brief before we get into a session. So it's totally up to you how you like to run the show. I think one last point I would make on giving context and the reason for it is even if you don't share with the astrologer what you want to talk about and you want to just kind of see what the astrologer has to say, starting to think about what it is that you really need answered helps to filter out the things that are just noise. Because very often people will say, oh, I want to talk about my health and money and relationships and profession, but there's really only one or two of those things that are truly bothering them. So my advice is, in order for you to get into that headspace so that you can filter out the noise and again, maximize the time that you're spending with the astrologer and maximize the resources that you've put into it, it's good to start thinking about the questions that you want answered, even if you don't share with the astrologer in advance. Every transit reading is going to differ from astrologer to astrologer, but I like to take a more macro thematic approach to start off with. So we're going to say, the 2-3 year forecast. What are some of the bigger themes that you're in? And then we go babushka doll situation where we talk about the year, and then we go into the month to month and maybe highlight a few of the key time periods. Some astrologers will take the view of really just focusing on the specific time periods that they think you should know about and that you should really think about, or one or two of the key themes. Again, if you have asked questions beforehand, then that is also definitely going to be part of the reading, and that's going to be addressed either in the beginning or during the reading. This can also sometimes be a more mechanical reading in the sense that there's lots of dates or you're thinking about time frames. There's always a recording. Generally speaking, nowadays we have recordings. You can run it through your AI transcript and get all the summaries and dates. I also provide an optional personalized calendar so you can visualize things as they overlap. Lots of astrologers have different options of how to visualize that experience for you, so you can ask if you have any doubts. This is a much more granular experience, and we may not address every single thing in your birth chart. We are going to try and address the things that are pertinent for you in that particular year. So again, if you have questions, don't be afraid to ask them. And I also find that the long-term transits here are more pertinent, even though the short-term periods are interesting. When we have a knowledge of the long-term transits, it also helps us from getting analysis paralysis. So, for example, if this is a year about meditation and spiritual growth, then you know you're going to be focusing on that area of your life. You may not be so focused on your health and wellness right now. You may not be focused on the physical part. Maybe the money piece isn't growing as quickly as you wanted, but your spiritual life is really flourishing. So know that the divine timing, as I mentioned before, is coming, but also when we know where we should be focused, we're going to be less likely to get frustrated and running into the wrong thing. The short-term transits are nice to know because it can help us, especially in times of a lot of transition. And oftentimes, I think if a client is going through a period of a great transition, so a lot of different moving parts, then the short-term transits can help us divvy out, okay, this month is going to be more challenging, this month is going to be easier, this is the month about work, this is the month about play. I'm not saying that knowing these transits is going to make things easier, but it's definitely going to help us understand what the right path is for us. And that's the most important takeaway that we want from these transit readings. Another question I get asked a lot is, when should I do the year ahead forecast? And the answer is whenever you feel like it, because that is when you are going to be ready to receive the information and ready to use astrology as part of your toolkit. The second best time that I recommend getting the reading is around your birthday. If you are someone that likes to get your annual reading, I think the birthday is a nice time. When we have our birthday, we are welcoming in new transits. We are welcoming a new cycle. But going back to my earlier point about coming in when you feel like it, people are getting readings because certain cycles are changing and shifting over. Like maybe you are entering into a career cycle, maybe you are entering into a family cycle. So you're coming in at the start of something new, and we are going to be able to get into that important piece of information. Other people like to take a different approach. For example, maybe you plan your year at the start of January, so that is a better time for you, or at the start of the school year. The Lunar New Year is another popular one. The spring equinox is another one. So you can use whatever symbolic measure of time is important for you. But the key thing is that I always find that when you're ready to get a reading, you know it. There's a tipping point between thinking about getting a reading and pressing the booking button, and you can trust in that process. There are no hard and fast rules. So we've talked about the preparation pre and what to expect during, how to get the most out of your readings, and then there's the part immediately afterwards. So I know we have to sometimes just rush into the next thing, but if you can, you want to drink water, you want to rest, you want to let the dust settle and things to marinate, because you're essentially transitioning from one kind of space into another. And if you've had an astrology reading, you know what I'm talking about. You're not able to just skip right into a different space. I definitely am not. After the end of a reading, I am closing things out. I have my closing rituals. I need to rest. I need to regain my energy again. And you may have a similar experience, because what we're essentially doing is we are transitioning back to real life. And you may need some time for the dust to settle, and then certain questions may come up, which brings me to this follow-up question policy. Different astrologers have different approaches. Again, you can ask whether you're able to follow up and ask questions, or they may invite you to do that. I know a lot of astrologers who are happy to answer questions afterwards, of course, within reason, which is why I recommend trying to prepare what it is that you want to get out of the reading in advance, because that way you'll less likely have as many follow-up questions. Now, before you launch into 500 follow-up questions, I recommend listening to the recording again, because sometimes you're tapping into different parts of the conversation during the actual reading, But when you listen to the recording, some of your questions get answered. If that's not the case, then by all means, reach out to the astrologer or whatever it is that their policy is. But just know that, sometimes the recording can be helpful. I have some clients who listen to the recording right after. I am always surprised at how frequently people go back and listen to the recording throughout the year. Again, you can get different information during different times of the year. That's also something that you might consider in terms of how to get even more value out of your reading, which is go and listen to the recording again. Nowadays there's AI, you can run it through transcripts, get summaries, etc. But I also encourage you to listen to your voice and listen to the actual exchange during the reading, because that also will instigate or invite some part of you that you might not have considered, which can sometimes be missed in a transcription or in a summary. Now, after all of that is said and done, maybe there are questions that come up, and you might have to email or message the astrologer months later. The thing is that once the space is closed, it does take time for us to then revisit your chart and open it back up and revisit that experience that we had with you and the information that you provided. So the faster that you can ask the follow-up questions, I think the more results that you are going to get as well. Again, if the follow-up question is extending into what would be another reading, that will be something that I might flag. Or it could also be extending into something like a reading that only covers one question, which a lot of astrologers, including myself, offer as a sort of follow-up, which is a little bit meatier, but not quite a full reading. And on that closing note, how often you get the reading is totally up to you. We talked a little bit about the timing, but I know some people who they get their birth chart reading and then they get inspired by wanting to know more about their families, so they go into that realm, or they start to want to know what's happening year to year. The thing is, if I know that I have someone who's coming on an annual basis, I will have a working log of any feedback that you've given me, any updates that you've given me about your life. People underestimate how much we enjoy receiving that kind of feedback as astrologers because we're dedicated to the practice. We want to know what's happening in your life so that we can better serve you in the future. And that's another way that you can maximize your time with an astrologer, especially if you're seeing someone on a regular basis. Maybe you don't get in touch with them whenever something happens, but before a reading, you can always say, hey, these things worked out, these things didn't. These things transpired, and this relationship was in fact like this or wasn't. And that's going to give that person an opportunity to get even more into the specificities of your birth chart. So it is a working relationship. And because we see people less frequently than, say, therapists, sometimes people forget that little aspect. So hopefully you have a sense of what to expect from start to finish in an astrology reading. And to remember that every astrologer is different. So when in doubt, ask the questions. Just ask what their policy is on any one of the steps that we talked about. And the other thing is that to remember that as astrologers, we want to make sure that you are getting the most out of your reading, that you are able to connect to astrology in the way that we have connected to it and that we are so excited to share with you. But with all that in mind, there are these steps that we've discussed today that can help you prepare both from a technical perspective as well as from a psychic perspective to enter into that space and maximize the time that we spend together.